Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Mercer said about Katie Morrison at 6:56 a.m. on a Tuesday, his voice sharp enough to cut sutures, his eyes tracking her hands as she inserted a central line into a post-op patient's subclavian vein with the kind of precision that made residents pause mid-step. He didn't know. He had no idea. The needle went in at exactly the right angle, one clean motion, no fumbling, no second attempts. The kind of insertion you only saw on surgeons with 15 years of experience, not on nurses with limited credentials, as he liked to say when he thought the ICU couldn't hear him. But that wasn't the worst part. St. Michael's Hospital in Raleigh sprawls across 12 acres like a concrete cathedral, all glass and steel, and the smell of antiseptic layered under something older, floor wax, human desperation, the copper penny scent of blood that never quite washes away. The ICU occupied the 4th floor, East Wing, where fluorescent lights hummed their constant 60 Hz song and machines beeped in rhythmic conversation. Katie moved through this world at 0600 hours, before the day shift arrived, checking lines and adjusting drips with the kind of quiet attention that made colleagues ask her to double-check their work, though no one ever said why. They just trusted her hands. They just knew. She'd been at St. Michael's for 3 years and 2 months. 42 months of 8-hour shifts bleeding into 12-hour doubles. 42 months of patients who asked for her by room number because she didn't treat them like problems to be solved, she treated them like people still tethered to their bodies by the thinnest threads. An elderly man with metastatic lung cancer once told her, "You move like someone who understands pain is information, not a punishment." Katie didn't correct him. Pain was information. You learn to read it the way other people read maps. Her jacket hung in locker 847 at the end of the staff room, navy blue, standard-issue hospital wear, wrinkled from being compressed between 12-hour shifts and the weight of things she couldn't discuss. The patch was sewn into the lining, faded now, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it, a SEAL Team 3 insignia in muted greys and blacks. She touched it between shifts, her left hand reaching inside the lining, her fingers finding the stitching like a prayer that didn't require words. The tremor in her ring finger came and went. Mostly went. Mostly. At 06 for 5, Katie stood at the bedside of patient 4127, a 63-year-old construction manager named Holloway who'd come in 4 days ago with a pulmonary embolism. His post-operative anxiety had him waking at 2 a.m., convinced his heart was stopping, convinced the monitors were lying. The night shift had called for an anxiolytic, but Katie had other ideas. She approached his bedside while a resident, a 26-year-old named Patel who'd been at St. Michael's exactly 6 months, watched from the doorway. Holloway's eyes were already moving, scanning the ceiling tiles like they held secrets. His left hand plucked at the oxygen cannula. Katie placed her own hand over his. Not pressing. Just contact. Holloway. Look at me. He looked. Your heart rate right now is 88. Your oxygen is 97%. These numbers are steady because you're steady. Your body knows what to do. Sometimes your mind just hasn't caught up yet. She kept her voice at the frequency that made people listen, not soft, exactly, but anchored. Low. The kind of voice that suggested she'd weathered storms he couldn't imagine. Which she had. Holloway's shoulders dropped. His breathing slowed. By 06:58, he was asleep, his hand still resting under hers. Patel didn't move from the doorway. When Katie passed him on her way to the supply cart, the resident met her eyes. How did you do that? He needed permission to believe the machines, Katie said. She didn't look back. At 0710, Dr. Marcus Mercer arrived for rounds. Mercer was 52, board-certified in critical care medicine, Ivy League credentials framed in his office on the 2nd floor, Yale Medical School, Harvard residency, fellowship at Johns Hopkins, the kind of pedigree that made him believe intelligence could be measured in institutional prestige. He'd been practicing medicine for 21 years and had spent the last 3 convinced that his hospital was being infiltrated by competent nurses, which he experienced as a personal threat. A hierarchy had rules, and Katie Morrison seemed to have forgotten hers. He watched her place a new central line in patient 4098, a 41-year-old woman post-cardiac surgery. The patient was sedated, monitored, her chest wrapped in clean bandages that Katie changed with a kind of technical precision that belonged in an operating room, not in a hospital wing staffed by people without medical degrees. Mercer stood at the end of the bed, arms crossed, his presence like pressure against glass. Katie prepped the site, chlorhexidine, sterile field, her movements economical and exact. The needle went in at the correct angle. She advanced it with the kind of feel that only came from having done something hundreds of times, maybe thousands. The guide wire followed. The catheter slid home. She flushed it. Secure. Complete. 40 seconds total. Mercer's jaw tightened. He said nothing until they were outside the room, his voice pitched low enough that only the resident, Patel again, trailing behind like a medical student on a death march, could hear. That's rote procedure work. Nursing school teaches it well enough. Anyone competent with their hands can place a line. He didn't look at Katie. He was already moving toward the next room, but his words hung in the air like smoke. The key is knowing when not to place lines. That requires medical judgment. That's why we have doctors. Katie kept walking. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. In this part of the morning, in this particular hallway where the fluorescent lights buzzed their endless song and the smell of antiseptic was stronger than anywhere else on the floor, she'd learned how to wear her silence like armor. She didn't flinch. She didn't respond. She simply existed in the space of his contempt the way she'd learned to exist in other kinds of fire. Patel's face had colored, embarrassment on behalf of someone who wouldn't acknowledge she'd been insulted. But Katie was already 10 steps ahead, her attention already shifting to the next patient, the next task, the next moment where her hands could speak for her. What Dr. Mercer didn't know, what he had no idea about, was that he'd made a decision in that moment. Not consciously. He was too arrogant for conscious decision-making. But somewhere in the part of his brain that understood hierarchies and threats, he decided that Katie Morrison represented a problem. A soft-spoken woman with calloused hands who commanded respect he had to demand. A nurse who moved through his hospital with the kind of quiet authority that made residents trust her more than they trusted him. That couldn't be tolerated. That would need to be eliminated. By 08:45, Mercer was in his office on the second floor, pulling Katie's personnel file from the hospital system. 3 pages, sparse and functional, education, Bachelor of Science in Nursing, University of North Carolina School of Nursing, graduated 2018. No advanced degree. No master's. No credentials beyond the RN license that any competent technician could obtain. Previous employment history showed a 5-year gap with no explanation, which Mercer noted and filed away like a piece of evidence. Work history before that, a Navy medical facility in San Diego. Nothing specific. Nothing classified. Nothing that explained why her hands moved like they'd been trained by something that wasn't medical school. Mercer steepled his fingers. His brother-in-law was on the hospital board. His college roommate was the chief of staff. He had relationships in place, networks built over 2 decades of strategic kindness, buying drinks, remembering birthdays, lending money that was always meant to be repaid with favors. He looked at Katie's file and saw an opportunity. A young woman without institutional protection. A nurse with a gap in her employment that might hide all kinds of liability. A person whom he could systematically dismantle, one public humiliation at a time, until she either quit or gave him grounds for termination. His smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. He saved the file to his desktop and returned to rounds. At 11:30, Katie was in the medication room preparing drips when Nurse Chen pushed through the double doors, her expression a careful neutral that meant she'd witnessed something uncomfortable. "Mercer's on the warpath," Chen said quietly. "Told a resident that nurses are the reason medicine looks like fast food now. That we teach competence without context, hand without judgment." Chen shook her head. "He meant you. We all knew he meant you." Katie measured out 100 milliliters of saline into a sterile container. The measurement was exact. Everything she did was exact. "He's afraid," she said. "Of what?" Chen's voice carried genuine confusion. "He's a doctor. He has everything. He's afraid of people who don't need his validation to believe they're competent." Katie capped the drip and labeled it with precise letters. "That's the only real threat to people like him." Chen watched her work. After a moment, she said, "You're not actually just a nurse, are you?" Katie met her eyes. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The question itself was the confirmation. By 1400 hours, when Katie was back in the ICU monitoring vitals and adjusting medications and doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept people alive, Dr. Mercer was in the conference room with 3 junior residents, including Patel. He sat at the head of the table like a prosecutor, his hands folded, his voice conversational in a way that made cruelty sound like education. "The danger of nursing excellence," he said, "is that it creates the illusion of medical judgment. A nurse can develop significant technical skill, that's not in question. But technique and judgment are different domains. We see nurses sometimes who think they've crossed that boundary. Who act like they understand medicine because they understand procedures." He paused, letting the room absorb his meaning. "That confusion is dangerous. For patients. For the hospital. We need to watch for it. We need to address it before it becomes a liability." Patel didn't speak. But he thought of Katie's hands on Holloway's hand. He thought of patient 4098 central line, perfect and complete. He thought of the way she'd moved through the ICU like she was reading a language everyone else was still trying to learn. He said nothing. And that silence, that small, unremarkable moment where no one challenged Dr. Mercer's reframing of competence as threat, was the moment Katie Morrison's 3-year tenure at St. Michael's Hospital began its countdown to catastrophe. Conference Room B smelled like stale coffee and the particular dread that only medical grand rounds could generate. 20 residents crowded shoulder to shoulder, their white coats pressed against each other like penguins in a warming huddle, their eyes fixed on the projection screen where Dr. Mercer had just illuminated Katie Morrison's charting from 3 weeks prior. The screen glowed harsh and clinical, pulling her initials, KM, into unflattering relief under the fluorescent lights overhead. "This," Mercer said, his voice carrying the kind of measured disdain reserved for teaching moments designed to wound, "is what happens when nursing school prioritizes feelings over protocol." He adjusted his glasses, an unnecessary gesture, a deliberate pause to let his audience absorb the implication. Nurse Morrison here documented post-operative pain as 8 out of 10 without quantifying intervention response times. No timeline. No efficacy measurement. No rigor. He turned to face the residents. "In my ICU, we practice medicine. Not hand-holding." Katie stood against the back wall of Conference Room B, her posture identical to every other moment of her life in this hospital, shoulders squared, hands at her sides, face carved from something harder than marble. She had learned long ago that the only way to survive public humiliation was to refuse to participate in it. Mercer needed her to flinch, to flush red, to offer an explanation that would only dig the hole deeper. She gave him silence instead. Cold. Absolute. The kind of silence that belonged in operating theaters and on patrol routes where words got soldiers killed. The residents shifted their weight, uncomfortable. Dr. Patel from the nephrology service glanced at Katie, then quickly away, that particular brand of awkward sympathy reserved for people watching someone get executed in slow motion. One resident, a 3rd-year named Chen, stared at his shoes as if they contained answers about how to exist in a moment like this. Mercer continued for another 3 minutes, pulling up 2 more examples of Katie's charting, magnifying perceived deficiencies into apparent incompetencies, each critique delivered with the precision of someone who had spent hours preparing this ambush. "This is the standard we're maintaining in this ICU," he concluded. "I want all of you to recognize the difference between adequate documentation and excellence." The subtext hung in the stale air like copper-tainted blood. Nurse Morrison represents the former. Katie didn't move. Didn't look away. When Mercer finally dismissed the residents and they filed out past her, several refused to make eye contact. That was fine. She had stopped needing eye contact years ago. For days later, Katie found herself at the vending machine on the third floor, the one in the break room that always jammed on the second row, that smelled faintly of artificial fruit punch and someone's microwaved fish from lunch. She was selecting chamomile tea, a deliberate choice to be somewhere solitary, when Dr. Mercer rounded the corner as if he had been tracking her movements, which, she would later understand, he had been. "I've been reviewing your credentials, Morrison," he said, his voice low but designed to carry. Two interns stood 6 feet away, pretending to check their phones with the kind of ostentatious focus that made their eavesdropping obvious. "Community college nursing program. My dental hygienist has more rigorous training." Katie's tea landed in the tray with a soft metallic clink. She straightened her spine, a minimal adjustment that somehow made her taller, made her shoulders broader, made the air between them feel denser. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. When she finally spoke, it was after 5 full seconds of silence, a pause that felt like standing in the eye of something terrible and calm. "You mistake cruelty for authority because you've never learned the difference." The words hung there. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of finality that belonged to people who had made life-and-death decisions in rooms where hesitation was a death sentence. Mercer's face darkened from his usual pale pink to something closer to eggplant. Veins bulged at his temples. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, a fish pulled from water, gasping for oxygen that wasn't coming. Katie turned on her heel and walked away. She didn't hurry. Didn't glance back. Just moved through the hallway with the steady confidence of someone whose next breath was guaranteed, whose next heartbeat was assured, whose presence in a room was not negotiable. Behind her, Mercer remained frozen at the vending machine, his face burning red, his authority suddenly feeling as fragile as wet tissue. The interns stared at their phones harder. Neither had seen anything. Neither had heard anything. In a hospital, that was how survival worked. What they didn't see was what happened in Dr. Mercer's mind in that moment. It was a shift so profound that Katie, had she understood it then, would have recognized it immediately. It was the moment when humiliation transformed into something far more dangerous. It was the instant when Mercer decided that public shame was insufficient, that he needed institutional weaponry, that he needed to construct not just a reputation but a legal framework for her destruction. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. His breathing became shallow and rapid. And behind his eyes, something cold and calculating began to metastasize. That same day, Mercer made his first phone call to the hospital's chief of staff. By evening, he had contacted the board's chairman. By the following morning, he had begun assembling a dossier, 3 years of Katie's charting, patient outcomes, any anomaly he could weaponize, any deviation from protocol he could magnify into negligence. He worked methodically, with the precision of someone who understood how institutional power functioned, how favors could be called in, how a carefully constructed narrative could turn competence into liability. 2 weeks later, a 52-year-old retired Marine named Donald Pritchard came crashing through the emergency room doors at 1,430 hours in the afternoon, his son supporting him on one side, his breathing moving wrong in a way that medical professionals recognized instantly as catastrophic. His chest heaved in that particular rhythm of someone whose lung had collapsed, whose trachea had deviated, whose oxygen saturation was plummeting with each shallow, inadequate breath. Skin the color of concrete. Lips already taking on that blue-gray quality that meant minutes, not hours. The surgical resident on call was a second-year named Martinez, competent in routine cases, suddenly molten and incapable when faced with the kind of emergency that required decisions instead of protocols. He moved toward the trauma bay and froze. Literally froze. His hands hung at his sides like objects he no longer recognized, his eyes went wide and unfocused, and the words coming out of his mouth became fragmented and uncertain. Tension pneumothorax, he whispered to no one in particular. The attending is in surgery. In the OR. For another hour. Katie was in the medication room, restocking the crash cart after a patient discharge, when she heard the words "Marine" and "can't breathe" through the open doorway. Her hand stopped. Her body became very still. And then something older than thought took over. Something that lived in muscle and bone, and the specific muscle memory of people who had made decisions that meant the difference between somebody's child coming home and a folded flag and a letter from a general. She moved. There was no deliberation. No hesitation. No moment where she considered that this was outside her scope, that Martinez was the doctor, that chain of command mattered more than the fact that Pritchard's color was turning gray. She found the 14-gauge needle in the crash cart, her fingers locating it without conscious thought, and she moved toward the trauma bay with the fluid precision of someone who had done this in Helmand Province, with mortars incoming and blood on her hands and the smell of cordite and copper filling her nose. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, she said to Rodriguez, the OR nurse assisting, not a question, a statement. She located the landmarks on Pritchard's chest, the second rib, the space above it, the precise anatomy of keeping someone alive, and she pushed the needle in with absolute confidence. No tremor. No doubt. Just the technical certainty of someone who had held lives together in her hands more times than she had fingers to count. The hiss of air escaping the collapsed lung sounded like redemption. The sinus rhythm appearing on the monitor sounded like grace. Pritchard's oxygen saturation climbed, 68, 72, 79, 88, stable. His color shifted back from concrete to human. His son started crying, that particular brand of crying reserved for moments when death recedes by fractions of an inch and hope suddenly becomes possible again. Rodriguez stared at Katie's hands. The way they had moved. The angle. The confidence that belonged only to people who had done this under fire, under pressure, in conditions where hesitation was another word for murder. Where did you serve? Rodriguez's voice was barely a whisper. Katie pulled off her gloves. I didn't. But Rodriguez saw it. Saw the way Katie's face went blank, that particular kind of blank that only happened when someone was shutting down access to rooms in their mind that civilians weren't supposed to enter. Saw the way her shoulders settled as if she had just set down a weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there. Dr. Mercer arrived in the trauma bay 4 minutes later, his expression moving through surprise to understanding to calculation in the space of a single breath. He surveyed the stable patient. The gathered crowd. Katie's hand still gloved in blood, still trembling, not from fear, but from the particular adrenaline crash of people who had just pulled someone back from the edge of the abyss. His eyes locked on hers. And she saw it. Saw the decision being made behind those eyes. Saw the moment when he understood that she was not what she pretended to be, that her competence was not procedural but visceral, that something in her background was precisely what he needed to weaponize to destroy her completely. Rodriguez stepped closer to Katie, but said nothing. In that moment, standing in a trauma bay in Raleigh, North Carolina, something shifted in the hospital's equilibrium. A line had been crossed. Mercer had seen something in Katie's hands that terrified him, not because it was criminal, but because it was real. And the next morning, he would make a phone call to an outside investigator and begin building a case so meticulous, so carefully constructed, that even the truth wouldn't be able to stop it. 72 hours. That was all Dr. Mercer needed to dismantle 3 years of work. He sat in his office on Wednesday morning at 6:38 a.m., before the hospital shifted into its daylight chaos, and he made the first phone call. The hospital president answered on the third ring. They always did when it was him. We have a problem, Mercer said, his voice carrying the particular gravity of a man who had never once been questioned. One of the ICU nurses performed an unauthorized emergency procedure on a patient without resident oversight. A collapsed lung. Needle decompression in the trauma bay. Could have killed him. The president said nothing for 4 seconds. 4 seconds was enough. I want her credential file pulled, Mercer continued. And I want it done quietly. We need to move fast, before word gets out that we had a scope of practice violation on our hands. By Wednesday afternoon, Mercer had made the second phone call to the president, this time from the hospital parking lot, his voice tighter, more urgent. I've been reviewing her charting from the past 36 months, he said. There's a pattern. Small things. Protocol deviations. Administration errors. Nothing criminal, but negligent. Persistent negligence. We need an outside audit before this becomes a liability issue. The president authorized it before Mercer finished speaking. By Thursday morning, Mercer had activated 3 board members who understood the delicate economics of hospital politics. One owed him a referral pipeline worth $1.2 million annually. Another had a daughter in medical school who needed a residency slot. The third had been caught billing for procedures he didn't perform, and Mercer had noticed, had said nothing, had remembered. Now was the time to collect. Quiet consensus, he told them. Nothing documented yet. We're just ensuring due diligence on a staffing matter. By Friday at 8 a.m., he had hired Dr. Wilkins, a retired surgeon with a consulting firm and the kind of medical pedigree that could not be questioned. Wilkins had done work for 17 hospitals. Mercer had referred him to 5 of them. They had an understanding. Mercer handed Wilkins a folder in a coffee shop on Fayetteville Street, 8 blocks from St. Michael's. "I need this airtight," Mercer said, pushing the folder across the table like a man passing contraband. Fine protocol deviations. Charting inconsistencies. Anything that builds a pattern. She's been hiding something since day one, and I want her gone before she kills someone. Wilkins opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of Katie Morrison's shift charting from the past 36 months. Mercer had already marked 17 instances in red. Most of them were routine, a patient assessment done at 14:15 instead of 1400, a medication notation that could be interpreted as incomplete, a notation about patient demeanor changed that Mercer had bracketed with a question mark. "This is solid work," Wilkins said, turning pages. His hands moved with the confidence of a man who understood how to read documents for what he wanted them to mean. "The needle decompression was 3 days ago," Mercer said. "She moved into the trauma bay without authorization. Without the resident's consent. Without," he paused, letting the word sit in the air like smoke, "credentials on file for emergency procedures." Wilkins didn't look up. "How much time do you need?" 72 hours from now. "Have something we can present to HR on Monday." By Friday at 2:02 p.m., Mercer had scheduled a meeting with the Chief of Staff. He arrived with a leather portfolio and a presentation printed on cream-colored paper that cost $4.87 per page to produce. The Chief of Staff was named Dr. Paulson, and he had never once questioned Mercer's clinical judgment. They had attended Johns Hopkins together in a program where credentials were currency and doubt was weakness. "We have a compliance issue," Mercer began, not sitting until Paulson gestured him into the chair. "One of our ICU nurses. Competent on the surface, but I've been tracking behavioral patterns that suggest systemic scope of practice violations." Paulson opened the portfolio without asking. Mercer had chosen it that morning from 3 options, settling on leather that suggested professional weight. "She performed an emergency procedure on Tuesday without resident supervision," Mercer continued, his voice steady as pulse. "But it's not the procedure that concerns me, it's the pattern. She's been operating outside her credentials for months. Charting inconsistencies. Assessment timing issues. Documentation gaps." He turned a page. "I've hired an outside auditor. He'll have a formal report by Monday. I wanted you to know before we proceed with suspension pending investigation." Paulson read silently. His fingers traced the red marks on a photocopy of one of Katie's shift notes. The mark indicated that a patient's vital signs had been recorded at 14:07 instead of 1400. A 7-minute variance on a routine observation. "This is serious," Paulson said finally. "It is," Mercer agreed. "But it's also contained. If we act quickly, decisively, we protect the hospital. Suspension pending investigation." Paulson said it like he was testing the words. "That requires HR sign-off. I've already prepared the documentation." Mercer withdrew a second folder from his portfolio. This one was thicker. "Everything Wilkins finds will be supplemental. But we have enough to move immediately. We have enough to remove her from patient care today." Paulson set the folders side by side on his desk. His fingers drummed once, twice, 3 times. He was a man who understood institutional protection, who knew that hesitation cost money and liability claims cost more. "Today," he said. "We'll have her badge pulled today. HR will handle the notification." By 1:08 p.m. on Friday afternoon, Katie Morrison's security badge had been deactivated by the access control system. She wouldn't know it yet. She was in the ICU with a patient, a 67-year-old man recovering from cardiac surgery, the kind of routine recovery that required vigilance and nothing more. She was charting post-operative vitals when the overhead page sounded, "Katie Morrison. Report to Human Resources. Katie Morrison, report to Human Resources immediately." The ICU fell silent for exactly 3 seconds. She didn't move. She finished entering the blood pressure into the EHR. She saved the note. She stood with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested she already understood what was coming, or perhaps that she didn't care. Rodriguez, a nurse at the station 3 feet away, watched her set down her pen. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and Rodriguez mouthed, "I'm sorry." Katie nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement. Then she moved toward the elevators with the same steady pace she brought to every task, no rush, no hesitation, no trembling in the hands that had held dying patients together. The HR office was on the 4th floor. The elevator ride took 43 seconds. Katie used the time to breathe, to feel the weight of her scrubs against her body, to touch the faded patch sewn inside her jacket, which hung in her locker 3 floors below. Ms. Chen from Human Resources was waiting with a manila folder. She had done this before, had the script of sympathetic professionalism memorized. "Katie, please sit down." "Katie Saturday. We're placing you on suspension pending investigation effective immediately. Your badge has been deactivated. You're not to access patient care areas or hospital systems. You can collect your personal items from your locker with security present, and then you need to leave the building." Katie didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The investigation hadn't started. The audit hadn't been completed. The accusations hadn't been formally stated. But the machinery was already in motion, and she understood machinery, how it moved, how it crushed things caught between its gears. "Do you understand?" Ms. Chen asked. "Yes," Katie said. "Your paycheck will continue through the end of the week. After that, your employment status is pending the investigation outcome." Katie nodded. She rose, moved toward the door, then paused. "How long?" "The investigation will take approximately 2 to 4 weeks. 2 to 4 weeks. 30 days without income. 30 days with her name attached to accusations she hadn't committed. 30 days of being a liability, a problem, a threat. But that wasn't the worst part. Security walked her to the locker room on the 5th floor. A guard named Patterson, who had always nodded at her during shift changes, now stood beside her in silence as she opened her locker. Her 3 years of work inside were minimal: a spare pair of compression socks, a book she'd been reading, a container of ginger tea, the jacket with the patch sewn inside. She removed each item slowly. The guard watched. In the distance, through the locker room window, she could see the ICU nurses at their stations. 3 of them glanced toward the locker room and then looked away quickly, the way people looked away from car accidents. Katie folded her jacket and placed it on top of the other items in her arms. The cardboard box Patterson offered felt like an accusation. She took it anyway, not because she needed it but because accepting it was easier than refusing. She loaded her belongings. The box was barely half full. "You're all set," Patterson said, and there was something almost apologetic in his voice, the kind of gentleness that made the moment worse. She carried the box through the ICU one last time. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like nothing was happening, like the machinery of institutional power hadn't just shifted her from valued employee to compliance risk. Rodriguez pretended to chart. Thompson pretended to look for supplies. Kim actually did look at her, held Katie's eyes for 1 second, 2 seconds, long enough for Katie to see the apology without the words. Katie walked through the sliding doors at the entrance of St. Michael's at 4:17 p.m. on Friday, carrying a cardboard box that contained 3 years of her professional life reduced to a book, compression socks, ginger tea, and a jacket she could never wear to this hospital again. The parking lot smelled like hot asphalt and diesel exhaust from the ambulances loading at the bay. The sky was clear. The temperature was 73 degrees. It was a perfect October afternoon, the kind that felt like mockery. She drove home, not to a house filled with people, not to somewhere safe, but to an empty kitchen where an 8-year-old daughter would arrive in 6 hours, ready to be picked up from after-school care, ready to ask why Mommy hadn't sent lunch money this morning, ready to ask why Mommy was home when Mommy wasn't supposed to be. Katie sat at the kitchen table at 5:12 p.m. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She didn't allow herself any of the release that normal people used when their lives collapsed. Instead, she reached into the jacket pocket and withdrew the faded unit patch, Navy SEAL insignia, worn from 30 years of being hidden, from 3 decades of pretending it didn't exist. She held it in her palm and stared at the unit designation, Bravo Platoon, 2001 to 2006. She was a captain. She had led people into hell and brought them out the other side. She had seen things that would break most humans into pieces. She had saved 43 lives in 72 hours when everyone around her was dead. She had been buried, given a new name, a new social security number, new instructions to never surface. And now she was sitting in a kitchen in Raleigh, unemployed, suspended, accused of crimes she hadn't committed by a man whose entire career was built on the kind of fragile cruelty that required constant feeding. The clock on the wall ticked. An hour passed. Then another. At 6:11 p.m., her daughter would need to be picked up. The school charged $15 per minute for late pickup. Katie didn't move. She held the patch and waited for something, salvation or destruction, she wasn't sure which anymore. And then her phone rang. The parking lot at 2 in the afternoon was almost empty. Katie sat in her car for 3 minutes with the keys in the ignition, unable to turn the engine off or turn it on, suspended in the amber light between leaving and arriving home. Her badge was already in the hospital's possession, handed over by security with the same tone one uses when escorting a criminal from a building. 23 years of nursing licenses, certifications, performance reviews, and muscle memory meant nothing against a man who had simply decided she was a threat. The cardboard box sat on the passenger seat, her locker's contents, a few coffee mugs, a photo of Mia from kindergarten, 3 textbooks from night school, and the jacket. She reached over and pulled it toward her, fingers sliding inside the lining where the patch had been sewn in invisible stitches for 3 years. Faded Navy SEAL unit insignia. The only physical proof she'd ever been Captain Morrison. The only evidence that Helmand Province wasn't a nightmare she'd invented. She drove in silence, no radio, no phone, just the sound of tires on asphalt and her own breathing, measured and controlled, the way you breathe when you're trying not to scream. Route for 40 stretched out like her accusation. Traffic moved past her but she barely registered it. The steering wheel was slick under her palms. When she pulled into the driveway of the small ranch house at 2:38 p.m. on a Tuesday, the mailbox was full of bills and a letter from the hospital's legal department that she didn't open. The key stuck in the lock the way it always did. Inside, the house smelled like Mia's apple juice and the faint chemical signature of artificial vanilla from a plug-in air freshener. Katie walked to the kitchen table and sat down. The jacket was still in her hands. She unfolded it across the table like evidence at a trial, found the interior lining, and ran her thumb over the patch. Her unit. The men whose names she'd memorized the morning they all died. The 43 soldiers who walked out of Helmand because she didn't break, not when the Chinook was burning, not when the mortars started, not when the medevac took 6 hours and she was the only medic still conscious. The patch was the size of a playing card, edges faded from 3 years of being hidden. She stared at it with the intensity of someone trying to communicate with the dead. 1 hour passed. The light through the kitchen window shifted from west-facing amber to something softer, more forgiving. Katie hadn't moved. She wasn't crying, her face was completely still, the kind of still that only comes after you've learned that movement doesn't change anything. Her hands rested on the table, palms down, and if you looked carefully you could see they were shaking. Not from fear. From something else. From the weight of invisible people sitting in the empty chairs around the table. From the understanding that she'd spent 3 years healing strangers while the one soldier who mattered, the one she owed everything to, might be the only thing that could save her now, and saving him was no longer allowed. The front door opened at 3:57 p.m. Small footsteps. Mia was home from her after-school program, her backpack sliding off her shoulder as she called out, "Mom? You're home early." Katie looked up. Her 8-year-old daughter stood in the doorway with her lunchbox still in her hand, her blonde hair in 2 braids that were already coming loose, her school uniform wrinkled in that way that meant she'd been playing on the grass during pickup. Katie's entire face had to reorganize itself, not to hide her falling apart, but to prevent it from exploding into the room where a child could see it. She managed, "Hi, baby." Mia came closer, her intuition sharper than any adult's. She set down her backpack and lunchbox and moved to the table, studying her mother the way children do when they sense that the world has tilted. "Why are you home? You work until 7. Katie looked at the patch still spread across the table and quickly folded the jacket, placing it on the back of her chair. "I had to leave early." "Are you sick?" "No." "Did something happen?" Katie reached out and pulled her daughter close, burying her face in Mia's hair, breathing in the scent of her, sun and playground dirt and the strawberry shampoo Katie bought every week. Over Mia's small shoulder, her hand started to shake harder. Not where the child could see the tremor, but there, just below the table, Katie's fingers opened and closed against her thighs, the only part of her that would allow itself to break. She didn't answer the question. Couldn't. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that the man you've been fighting off for 3 years finally won, that your job is gone, that the life you built out of lies is collapsing, that everything you hid to keep her safe has just been burned to the ground? "Mom, you're scaring me." Katie pulled back and looked at her daughter's face, the small face with her eyes, the worry lines that shouldn't be on a 3rd grader's forehead. She said, "Everything's going to be okay." It was the lie parents tell themselves when everything is already broken. Mia wasn't convinced. She climbed into Katie's lap the way she used to when she was smaller, before school and logic started to rewrite her understanding of how the world worked. They sat like that as the afternoon light faded to evening, as the house grew darker and cooler, as Katie's mind moved forward to all the practical disasters waiting, mortgage due in 9 days, health insurance gone, another gap in her resume that she'd have to explain in whispers. She held her daughter and didn't let her see the tears that finally came, silent and cold, running down her face in the dark kitchen where no one was watching. She didn't move until Mia fell asleep against her shoulder. She carried her upstairs and laid her in bed and came back downstairs to sit with the jacket again, the patch visible in the darkness, visible only because she knew exactly where to look. The call came at 6:34 a.m. the next morning. St. Michael's Hospital switchboard. "Captain Morrison." The voice was tense, military-clipped. "We have a critical admission. Navy SEAL General Howard Crenshaw, rappelling accident, multi-trauma with massive subclavian bleed. ETA 8 minutes. Your assistance is requested." Katie's hand froze on the coffee maker. They were calling her. Not asking. Requesting. As if she still had a badge, still had clearance, still had the right to be in that hospital. She was dressed and in her car in 4 minutes. The trauma bay at St. Michael's was already in full mobilization when Katie arrived. She didn't have her badge anymore, so she wore a visitor pass clipped to her scrub jacket, the same scrub she'd worn yesterday, still wrinkled from sitting all night. The parking lot erupted with activity, a black Suburban, 2 additional vehicles, men in civilian clothes with the bearing of military personnel moving with choreographed efficiency. Katie could see it in the way they walked, in the arrangement of their bodies, active-duty operatives. Not the kind you sent for a simple training accident. Something else was happening. She pushed through the emergency entrance. The triage nurse at the front desk, Rodriguez, someone Katie had worked with for 18 months, looked up and froze. "You're not." "I know," Katie said, moving past her toward the trauma bays. "Where is he?" "Katie, you can't be back here." "You? Where?" The urgency in her voice, the two words delivered with the flatness of someone who'd stopped asking permission, made Rodriguez point without another word. "Trauma 2. Katie could hear the chaos before she reached the doors, multiple voices, the crash of equipment being repositioned, the aggressive beeping of a monitor registering a body in critical descent. She could hear the attending, Dr. Paulson, good surgeon, steady hands, barking orders in a voice that was already panicked. "We need 2 units of O negative, get me a level 1, somebody get a femoral line in." The doors opened and she could see him on the table. 60s, massive build, skin already the pale grey of massive blood loss, his chest lacerated from the concrete impact. The left subclavian artery was tearing and bleeding, the surgical team trying to apply pressure with gauze that was already soaked through in seconds. He was going to die. Right there on the table, with 4 surgeons and nurses around him, Katie could see the moment calculation happening on their faces. He was losing blood faster than they could replace it. The pressure was dropping, 80 systolic. 75, 68. Katie moved into the room. She didn't think about it. She didn't check with anyone. Her hands were already reaching for gloves, her mind already mapping the architecture of a subclavian artery bleed, already calculating where the clamp needed to go, how deep, the exact angle that would stop the hemorrhage without destroying the vessel. Muscle memory took over. Muscle memory that went back to Helmand Province, to a convoy exploding, to holding pressure on a wound while mortar fire came in at coordinates that had to be wrong because the impact was too close, too loud, too everything. 100 battlefield surgeries lived in her hands. 100 soldiers who should have died but didn't because she knew exactly how to reach into a chest cavity and hold a life in place. "Who the hell are you?" Paulson didn't look up from the field, but the attending resident next to him turned, seeing the visitor badge, her face going red. Katie didn't answer. She just moved into position and extended her hand. A nurse, autopilot, training deeper than thought, slapped a Kelly clamp into her palm. The subclavian was completely exposed now, the bleeding so heavy that the entire lower half of his body was glistening, slick with blood. Katie's hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd been trained to the point of second nature. She found the vessel. She angled the clamp. One motion. Smooth. Practiced. The bleeding stopped. It wasn't a request. It was control. Complete and certain and absolute. "You need to step back," Paulson said, but there was doubt in his voice now. Confusion. She'd stopped the impossible hemorrhage in 6 seconds. "Subclavian is clamped," Katie said. Her voice had dropped an octave. "I need a 6-0 Prolene on AC, 1 needle and a small lap sponge." The attending looked at Paulson. Paulson looked at Katie's hands, steady, precise, moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He stepped back. "Do it." Katie was working the repair when the man on the table, the general, though she didn't know that yet, opened his eyes. They were morphine hazy but conscious, and they tracked directly to her face. His lips were still around the intubation tube, but his mouth moved, trying to form something, trying to speak around the plastic in his throat. One word. Barely a whisper. Barely audible. But Katie heard it. "Reaper." She froze for 1/10 of a second. Just long enough for everyone in the room to notice. Just long enough for the understanding to begin. The door burst open and Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway, his face already purple with rage. "What is this? Who authorized unauthorized personnel in my surgical bay? Security. I want her in cuffs now. She's a terminated employee, she's a liability lawsuit walking around." But Mercer's voice didn't matter anymore. Because the man who'd been standing silently in the corner the entire time, a Marine colonel, stone-faced, watching everything with the attention of someone trained to observe, stepped forward. He wore civilian clothes but he moved like a rifle. His hand came out of his jacket holding a tablet. "Captain Katie Morrison," he said. The words landed like demolition. Service number. And that was when everything changed. The hospital administrator burst through the OR doors at 18:47 hours like a man who'd been told the building was on fire. His face had gone the color of old surgical gloves. She has no credentials. No authorization. Security, remove her immediately. This is a liability nightmare. We're talking about the hospital's exposure, the insurance implications. I need legal on the phone right now. Katie's hands didn't pause. The subclavian artery was clamped. The bleeding had stopped. The general's vitals had stabilized for the first time in 23 minutes, and the administrator was still talking. The OR fell silent in the way that operating rooms do when someone without medical training speaks loudly into sterile space, a silence that felt like a hand pressed against a throat. Then a Marine colonel stepped into the room. Stone-faced. Command presence radiating from him like heat off asphalt. He was holding a tablet. "Sir, you need to stop talking," Vickers said. Not a request. A command. The administrator turned. "Who the hell are you? This is a civilian hospital, we don't answer to." Captain Catherine Morrison, Vickers read from the tablet, his voice dropping to that register that makes sergeants listen and privates straighten their spines. Navy Cross for Valor in Helmand Province. Saved 43 lives under sustained enemy fire when her convoy was ambushed and every other medic was killed in the first 90 seconds. Service number 762-44-8891. Clearance level TS-SCI with Poly. Declassified as of 0300 this morning by executive order. He paused. Let that sink in. She is here under direct Pentagon authority. Not hospital authority. Pentagon authority. Dr. Mercer shoved through the second set of OR doors at exactly 18:51 hours, still wearing his street clothes, his necktie flapping like a wounded bird, his voice climbing 2 octaves the way cowards' voices do when they've already lost control. This is absolutely unacceptable. Unauthorized surgical personnel, flagrant violation of credential requirements. I'm calling the board. I'm calling the state medical board. The liability alone, the insurance company will crucify this hospital. Katie didn't look up from the general's chest cavity. Her hands were steady as surgeons' hands get only after they've done it 300 times under fire. The general's eyes opened. Slowly. Deliberately. Like a man waking from a long sleep and remembering exactly where he was and why. He looked straight at Katie. His hand moved toward the endotracheal tube. He was trying to talk. Trying to salute while lying on an operating table with his chest open and his lungs exposed to fluorescent light. Katie watched him grip the forestand and pull himself upright. 20 pounds of trained muscle working against pain receptors that should have kept him horizontal. Vickers stepped forward to stabilize him, but the general waved him off with the authority of a man who'd spent 32 years refusing help from anyone. He raised his right hand. Snapped a salute toward the wall. Toward nothing. Toward everything. Vickers activated the tablet. 3 rows of military ribbons bloomed across the OR wall in holographic projection, Navy Cross first, then silver stars, then purple hearts arranged like a constellation. Decorations that meant 51 combat deployments, 3 command tours, 2,000 lives trained and 1,000 lives saved. The general's hand never wavered. Dr. Mercer's voice cracked like a teenager's. "You can't do this. He's in an operating room. He's intubated. This is medical malpractice. You're documenting me as a witness." 3 words, Katie said quietly. Her voice sounded different now. Not the deferential nurse voice from morning rounds. This was the voice of someone who'd made life-and-death calls in a Helmand Province phi base with rockets incoming and medics dying and still found a way to move 43 people off the kill zone alive. "Sit down, doctor." The OR went still. Not quiet. Still. A stillness so complete you could hear the ventilator's rhythm, the monitor's beep, the faint hum of the refrigerators holding blood and plasma and the future. Dr. Mercer Saturday. That was when the video conference screen flickered to life on the rolling monitor. A 2-star general filled the screen. Someone's desk was behind him. Someone very important. You could tell by the way he occupied authority like other people occupy chairs. "This is Major General David Chen, Joint Special Operations Command," he said. "Captain Morrison's service record has been declassified by executive order. She is here under my authority. Any questions about that will be directed to the Pentagon. Any questions about her credentials will be directed to the Pentagon. Any questions about liability will be directed to the Pentagon's legal division, which has already contacted St. Michael's administration at the civilian level and informed them that filing charges against a declassified military asset is a federal crime." He paused. Breathed. "Captain Morrison, stand down. The general is in capable civilian hands now. Thank you for the save." The screen went dark. Dr. Mercer's hands were shaking. Not visibly. But Katie could see it in the way he gripped the OR counter, the way his breathing had gone shallow and fast like a man drowning in air. She didn't look at him. She was already instructing the surgical resident on vessel closure, already walking the general through post-op protocols, already becoming the captain again instead of the nurse who'd been suspended 4 days ago with a cardboard box of her belongings and no answers for her daughter. The administrator had left. Vickers was on his phone. The OR staff was working with the kind of fluid precision that happens when everyone suddenly understands the game was never actually in doubt. Mercer walked out backward, like a man who'd watched something ancient and terrible step out of darkness and decided that turning his back on it was a poor strategic choice. 6 months. That's how long it took for the investigation that Mercer had launched against Katie to turn into the investigation that dismantled Mercer. Dr. Wilkins, the auditor he'd hired to fabricate protocol violations, had done exactly what auditors do when they actually audit. She'd found the violations. All of them. But they had one important detail: they were all signed by Mercer. Surgical outcomes falsified for 2 years. Post-op complications buried in vague language. 3 patient deaths attributed to underlying conditions when the surgical notes themselves documented sepsis cascades that should have been caught in the ICU. 7 more patients with complications that Mercer had written off as unavoidable when review of the surgical video showed clear technique failures. Wilkins had called the state medical board before she called Mercer. She'd called the hospital president while Mercer's license was still being processed for suspension. She'd called Senator Hawkins, who'd made a phone call to General Chen, who'd made a phone call to someone with a much larger desk, and suddenly the question wasn't whether Mercer had tried to sabotage a Navy SEAL's career, it was whether he'd falsified outcomes on federal patients, federal paperwork, in a matter involving national defense. Katie heard about it from Rodriguez, the day-shift charge nurse, 6 weeks after the OR revelation. They were standing in the supply room, and Rodriguez was pulling gauze packs and trying to sound casual about how Mercer had been terminated, his medical license suspended pending criminal review, and apparently he was now teaching CPR recertification at a community college in Chapel Hill for $19 an hour. $19. Katie asked. $19, Rodriguez repeated. Plus whatever his attorneys are billing while they try to keep him out of federal prison. Katie finished stocking the cart. Said nothing. But she thought about the unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, about the 4 days when she'd believed the patch was the only proof she'd ever existed, about the way her daughter had asked if Mommy was broken because work made her sad. She thought about Mercer teaching basic life support to bank tellers and dental hygienists while his network of allies, the board members he'd cultivated for years, the hospital administrators he'd done favors for, the colleagues he'd protected through silence, all cut off contact the moment he became a liability instead of an asset. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon while Katie was completing the paperwork for a trauma transfer. St. Michael's main number. The hospital president himself. "Captain Morrison," he said. No preamble. "We'd like you back. Director of Trauma Services. Full restoration of seniority, back pay, and a formal apology from the board." Katie listened to her own breathing. Thought about the next chapter. Thought about the job she'd spent 3 years rebuilding her life around, the unit that had almost destroyed her when she lost them all in 90 seconds of fire, the work of keeping other people alive when your own team was ash. "I'll call you back," she said. "Tomorrow," the president said. I need an answer by end of business tomorrow. Katie hung up. Walked out of the hospital at 1730 hours. The evening light was moving across Raleigh like honey through water, and somewhere in the city, a man who'd once believed himself untouchable was answering phones that nobody else was calling. She drove home. Her daughter was waiting on the porch. Mia had grown 2 inches since the OR, or maybe Katie had just started noticing things again, the way her daughter's eyes had changed when she finally understood what her mother actually was. "Mom?" Mia asked. "You're early again." Katie sat down beside her on the steps. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Just watch the light change." "Captain Morrison's service record has been declassified," Katie said finally. "And people want to know what Captain Morrison's going to do next." "What are you going to do?" Katie thought about 43 lives. About needles and clamps and the weight of somebody else's last breath. About the patch inside her jacket lining that wasn't proof anymore because the whole world already knew. "I'm going to help people," Katie said. "Same thing I've always done. But this time, no more hiding." Mia took her hand. Squeezed it. The porch light flickered on. Automatic. Sensing them. And Katie Morrison, who'd spent 3 years as a nurse nobody believed and 6 months as a legend she'd never asked to be, finally understood that the two things weren't contradictory. They were the same thing. If you believe in honoring people who serve in silence, subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes and the moments they stop hiding. Like and comment with your own story of someone you underestimated who turned out to be extraordinary.